Chapter 6 Spellbound. Ferdinand looked at the line he'd written in perfectly formed loops and swirls. I searched the shipwreck, but I know not what I was trying to find. The crashing sea called him. He put his head against the cold wood of the deck, and tried doing Sedith's exercises to distract himself. A stretch from the ankle, from the knee, and then from the thigh. First one limb, then the other. The force sticking his feet to the ground felt impossibly heavy. In the sea, one could move any direction and feel completely weightless. Though he no longer stumbled with every attempt to walk, he was far from used to it. He stood and paced the small room in the lighthouse, trying to regain the correct rhythm. He would not let the sea's siren song call him back under, not after all he'd done to reach land. The desk contained a dog-eared detective novel, Sherlock Sholmes, and a stack of writing paper, as well as a quill pen and ink pot. A creased page was stuck to the wall above. It was a sketch of him, the waves of his hair rendered in exquisite detail. He knew the artist was probably the man Flane told him about. Hubert. Writing down memories was an attempt to shift the strange blur in his mind. It hadn't been much of a success. He saw colors sometimes, greens and purples and blacks, but he could recall nothing about the man named Hubert. He had a stack of paper almost a meter high covered in songs, poems, half-remembered constellations. Not a single fragment of anything could be attributed to Hubert. Flane and Sedith only gave him a sketch of their friendship. He wanted the complete painting, something that explained what pushed him to finally take the leap from one form to another. Life in the lighthouse was good. He went to the market with Flane. He was learning to drive Sedith's boat. He hadn't slept so deeply since he'd lived with his mother on the Eyre coast. He was safe, where nothing in the sea could hurt him. But he knew something was missing. Raised voices soared up from below. Ferdinand wondered if Flane had bought something frivolous from the market, and hoped she had. The bakery in the village cooked the most amazing stargazy pie. The stairs, as always, proved challenging. When he finally put his feet on solid ground, he heard Sedith growl, "She is not our emperor. We are going." Possibly there was no pie. In the kitchen, the two people who adopted him stood off. Between them, on the counter, rested a ripped envelope and a thick piece of card. Flane folded her arms and stared down Sedith with a gaze that made her look at least 100 years older.
"I think a matter such as this calls for a vote."
"A vote? That's it. I am burning every paper that makes it here from Enbarr." Flane ignored him and turned to Ferdinand.
"What say you, Ferdinand?"
She thrust the card at him. "Her Majesty Emperor Edelgard Fresfelg hereby cordially invites you to an audience at Enbarr Palace to discuss an official reward for your service to the crown." "We should go!" The answer came without thought. His mouth moved before his mind. "I wanted to go to Enbarr, to the opera, and I wanted to go dancing." There was something else he wanted, but he couldn't seize hold of it properly. It slipped from his mind like a bar of wet soap. Such a wonderful human invention. Flane took the card back.
"I think we shall require new clothing."
"You cannot trust Edelgard," said Sedith.
"Perhaps we could trust her closest aide, the one who owes us quite the debt."
"If you won't see sense, then I suppose I have no choice but to accompany you."
"Indeed, we should all enjoy the Emperor's reward together," said Flane. "Do not look so queasy. It will be fun. It has been so long since we last saw the capital."
Ferdinand felt himself tumble back into long-held fantasies. In Enbarr, the streets were permanently ablaze with lantern light. Nobles walked around in feathers and velvet from dusk until dawn. There was always music, always laughter. He remembered his mother's face as she spoke of it, and the longing he saw there.
"We'll leave tomorrow," said Flane. "You should both start packing."
The packing didn't take long, aside from clothes stolen, from long-suffering Sedith. There was only one thing Ferdinand wanted to take. He carefully removed the sketch from the wall and placed it inside the detective novel to protect it. From outside, the sea howled its protest. Ferdinand pressed 2 fingers to his forehead and braced himself for the angry winds. Once outside, he could barely see through the rain, which sliced horizontal strokes through the gale. His legs protested against the hard crags of his favorite rock, bumps and lumps his tail had once comfortably curled around. He tried several positions before he was satisfied. The sea quieted a little now. He was near again, and started singing its most tempting lullaby. "I will not return," he told it. "You gave me nothing but hardship." A roar as the water surged up. Ferdinand didn't bother scrambling away from it. Sodden strands of hair fell into his eyes. The weight of cloth sticking to his skin no longer felt foreign. He'd come to like having such a shield.
"You're going to catch a cold, silly," Flame called. "What are you doing?"
Ah, yes, sneezing. Yet another human thing he'd had grown used to. Saying goodbye. Flame sat next to him. Her rock of choice was much more sensible.
"You do not have to come. I arranged for Mr. and Mrs. Wiltgrove to take care of the lighthouse while we're gone. You could stay with them."
"Hubert is in Enbarr. I must go."
"I know you have questions, Father, and I cannot answer."
"There is much I want to see in Enbarr. But him I want to see most of all." Flame took his hand and squeezed it. They sat out together until the waves died down from their tantrum, and instead only lapped a mournful melody. The journey to the port was long and boring. On the plus side, Ferdinand got to make friends with a horse. She seemed not to mind. He had no idea what to do once he was in the saddle, and patiently followed Sedith and Flame. He was sad to say goodbye to her. The port smelled dank, like seaweed and rotting wood. It was crowded with fishermen, travelers, and tourists. They were dressed practically. Some had trunks of luggage trailing after them on trolleys, pushed by bored porters. Hey, you!" Someone grabbed Ferdinand's arm, and he jumped. A young man with freckles stared and stared at him. Ferdinand knew him. "But you're—" "Thank you for helping us with the post, Adam." Well, I suppose the letters will have to go the normal way if you're no longer, a fish?" Adam looked put out. "We've missed you in the post room. I thought you'd be back for food at least." "I've been through some changes recently." "I saw the letters from Enbarr with fancy seals on them. They're not kidnapping you or anything, are they? They didn't force you to go through these, changes? I heard Minister Vestra turns people into toads if they look at the Emperor wrong. You don't want to get on the wrong side of people from the city." "Of course not. No one forced me to do anything." "Well, good luck then." They shook hands, a human custom which meant you were friends. The exchange put Ferdinand in an odd mood. He'd gone from looking at Adam enviously to being his equal. Did he like it, or did it feel wrong? He wasn't sure. He felt almost embarrassed, thinking back to the times Adam had brought food for him. The ship took his mind off things. Ferdinand shunned the lower deck in favor of the ocean breeze. The sea was so much nicer when you didn't have to swim through its unpredictable tides. The weather was favorable, and before long they were stepping off the ship and into Enbarr's port. This was the journey Hubert would have taken. Ferdinand wondered if he was the type of man to enjoy the air, or find a quiet spot on the bottom deck, away from the elements. Hopefully, he'd soon find out. Already, the atmosphere was different. Ferdinand had never seen so many people, and all of them were so loud. They laughed and squabbled and tripped over their luggage. The sailors swore, and the ship's engines churned the port's waters into frothing columns. They had to queue to leave. They were people in black garb stationed at the port's exit. They wore strange masks with pointed fronts, like the beaks of birds. "What are they doing?" asked Ferdinand.
"I am not sure," said Flame. "They did not monitor people in such a way before."
When they got closer, Ferdinand could see 4 lanes. Each lane was staffed by a beaked guard. The guard ordered people to roll up their sleeves, and then stabbed them with a needle. He swallowed. Was it a test? Would they be able to tell he wasn't really human, just a clever fake? "Oh no," muttered Sedith. "They're taking blood." "Next!" The guard looked at them expectantly. "This is preposterous," said Sedith. "We did not agree to give blood. It is just a pinprick test, sir." "Out of the question. We have a letter from the Emperor, and it never said anything about such a test." He pulled the letter out from his tunic to show the guard. "I am afraid I still cannot allow you entry to the capital without a test, sir. Minister Vestra's orders." Sedith made a displeased, feral sound. "Get Minister Vestra for me right this second." "I'm afraid that will not be possible. Look, you're holding everyone up. Do you want to come into Enbarr or not?" Sedith snorted and made to march off. Ferdinand watched in dumb confusion. Were they really just going to get back on the boat and leave?
"Wait," said Flame. "It is just a bead of blood." "Yes? What are you testing for?"
"Disease." Ferdinand flinched. "I am not diseased." "Then you've got nothing to be afraid of, then." The needles looked very sharp, and therefore like something reasonable to be afraid of. But if that was all that stood between him and Enbarr—
"Father, this seems like a sensible precaution. I see no harm in it."
After further pleading, Sedith consented to the test. This was followed by grave concern when Ferdinand would not stop bleeding. They made him sit down for a quarter of an hour with a glass of water and some uncomfortable sticky gauze over the wound. Flame kept peering anxiously at him.
"Mer should heal quicker than humans."
"Hush," said Sedith. He was watching the masked guards. "I am all right," said Ferdinand. "Please, do not worry." The people just kept coming, wave after wave spilling out into the city. It reminded him of schooling fish, farmers and traders, and merchants and soldiers, and families, some quiet, some loud, some young, some old. They spoke differently to Sedith and Flame, and used words he did not know. He felt out of his depth, literally and figuratively, but there was no going back now. It was too wonderful. The guard came back to check on them. "You'll live," he told Ferdinand. "Your results were all a little peculiar." "Is there a problem?" asked Sedith. No problem. Just be careful out there." He lowered his voice. "Some friendly advice? It's probably best not to draw attention to your, blood." They were free to go. They arranged to stay at a discreet inn tucked into the artisan district. Ferdinand wanted to look at the shops, but they needed to prepare for their visit to Enbarr Palace. When Ferdinand saw his reflection, he didn't recognize himself, and his stomach swooped. He looked so human, like a picture from one of the papers. He'd followed Flame's advice and agreed to a suit in deep blue, the color of the sea on a bright day. It set off the color of his hair, which he did his best to braid into order. Sedith wore a belt around his dark tunic, in the same blue, and Flame had a blue ribbon for her hair. They looked like they all belonged together, and Ferdinand liked that very much. Enbarr Palace was bigger than he imagined. The walls seemed to go on forever. He couldn't imagine calling such a place home, like the Emperor did. Flame happily chatted with the palace guards about the plants in the garden, and how the challenging climate affected which species were thriving. All of them looked like they wanted to marry her. Sedith hung back with Ferdinand. "I thought the war was meant to rid of all this pomp and circumstance. I apologize if my conversation with the Emperor is not entirely pleasant. We tried so hard to do good work. Thanks to her, there is nothing left. You always help the people I rescued. You are still doing good work. I am grateful for everything you've done for me." Sedith's expression became a little gentler. "Rhea also adopted people with nowhere else to go. I honor her how I can. I suppose one person can only do so much." They stepped over the palace threshold. Inside, they were passed to a different set of guards. Ferdinand stared up at the marble-arched ceiling, then at twin spirals of stairs spinning up and up. He suddenly felt very small. The new guard spoke stiffly and refused to be charmed by Flame. "When we enter, you must bow or curtsy when I do. Do not turn your back to the Emperor, nor may you touch her. You may talk when she allows, laugh if she does first. You must not—" "Yes, yes," Sedith said, waving a dismissive hand. "We know the imperial customs. They haven't changed for hundreds of years." The guard looked put out, but they were already at the doors of something he called the reception room. Everything inside, including the Emperor, was red and gold. On the ceiling was a mural of a figure he recognized from the church books as Seros, crowning a man with pale brown hair. Their faces were serenely content, and the pair were shrouded by pink-cheeked people holding instruments. "Your Majesty, I did inform the guests of royal protocol," spluttered the guard. Ferdinand had forgotten to bow. He did so at once. Sedith and Flame remained still. "I am sure you did," the Emperor said. She was smaller than Ferdinand imagined, almost doll-like, with her long, feathery ponytail and stiff crimson blouse. Her gaze was so piercing, he wondered if she could read his thoughts. She was not seated on a throne, but at a table, laden with an appetizing selection of cakes, biscuits, and pastries. "Please, sit. I thought we might take tea together." This time, Ferdinand waited for Sedith to move, before he followed suit. There were 5 chairs. He sat next to the empty one. The Emperor noticed him looking. "I have invited Hubert," she said. "It is unlike him to be so late, but perhaps it serves us well." She rested her chin on her hands. "Let us get straight to the point. I wish to know what you did to my retainer." "What has he accused us of?" asked Sedith stiffly. "I thought this was to be a short meeting about a reward. I would not have come for an interrogation." "You do not understand. He will tell me nothing," said Edelgard, slamming a hand down for emphasis. The teacups jolted, and the cutlery jangled. "I have tried begging. I have tried blackmail. I even tried absinthe. Not a word of what happened in the lighthouse to make him so... She trailed off. "Mournful." Ferdinand blinked. The Emperor wasn't what he expected. She sighed at their awestruck faces and poured the tea. "I thank you for saving his life, of course."
"Ferdinand did most of the saving,"
Flame prompted. She took a slice of cake and began to mash it into crumbs. Edelgard looked alarmed. It would probably be best to distract her from Flame's strange eating habits. "Yes, I pulled him from the shipwreck. Then there was a spell, and it went wrong. I know Hubert helped me. After I saved him, I dearly hoped to see him again so he could tell me everything. If I saw him, maybe I'd remember." "What kind of spell was it?" Ferdinand didn't answer. Edelgard tapped the side of her teacup impatiently. "That explains Hubert's reluctance to talk. He knows I don't care much for his magic." Ferdinand clammed up. He didn't know how much to say. The words, "I used to be a mer," sounded too ridiculous to suddenly blurt out over tea in a land so far from his own.
"We don't know what kind of spell," said Flame. "We would like to see Hubert and check. None of us can remember."
Ferdinand glanced at her, surprised at her bold lie. Sedith's lips tightened, but he didn't correct her. They were both as uncomfortable as he was. The Emperor rang an ornate bell, and the guard came dashing back in. "Fetch Minister Vestra, at once." "Yes, Your Majesty." She took a demure sip of her tea as he left, both lady and emperor. Ferdinand was impressed at how easily she changed from one to the other. "I thought you were abolishing the nobility," Sedith said. "Yet you still hold the crown and the palace. I will unite Fodlan under an elected ruler eventually. But people cling to the old ways." Sedith did not take a sweet, or even look at his teacup. "The church offered a place of safety for many. How will you replace it?" "I will not. I plan to reform it. I cannot allow the church to be as it was. But I have appointed a minister of religion, Manuela Casagrande." "Manuela Casagrande. I very much value her opinion on such matters. She is formerly of the Church of Saros." "The name is familiar. She is from the Middle Franc Opera," said Ferdinand. He sang a couple of lines from Crimson Rain, which Flayn taught him on a long, sunny afternoon. There had been plays. He wanted to carry on. But then he glimpsed Sedith's eye twitching. Sedith liked a good book. He wasn't much for singing. "You have quite the voice," said Edelgard. "You put an opera performer in charge of reforming the church?" said Sedith. He sounded angrier than Ferdinand had ever heard him. "As final insults go, the Empire has outdone itself. Congratulations!" Edelgard's gaze became steely, a glimpse of the woman who conquered the continent. "I did not make my choice as an insult. Manuela is a strong, courageous woman who saved many lives. She's nothing but a figurehead. I am not sure how to prove my intentions."
"You could rebuild St. Sethleen's church," said Flayn. "The one by our lighthouse. It shelters many lost in the storms. Furthermore, it could act as a waypoint for traders from Morphis. I am sure their ships, given the danger of the area, will appreciate a place of safety."
Sedith gasped at her. She had clearly not run this gambit past him. She batted her eyelashes, all innocent. "Trade with Morphis is valuable indeed. An additional way to protect it is a good idea. I will need to consult with Parliament, but I am sure they will agree." The guard returned. "Many apologies, Your Majesty. It seems Minister Vestra has been unavoidably detained. He will see you in Parliament later on." "Very well. And if he happens not to be in Parliament, let him know I will not hesitate to call a city-wide search." "So we will not see him now?" said Ferdinand. He felt a sinking disappointment, which he tried to hide in his teacup. But with the way the Emperor looked at him, he knew he hadn't hidden it at all. "He cannot avoid you forever." Ferdinand wondered if he'd inconvenienced Hubert, or hurt him. Perhaps he shouldn't push for a meeting. Maybe it was best to let it lie. He opened his mouth to say, "Never mind," or "It does not matter." "I have to meet with him. I do not wish for any other reward." Edelgard smiled, her teeth very white against her red lipstick. "Then we need a plan." For once, Ferdinand's bright hair blended in. The people inside the dance hall wore jade, violet, lemon, sometimes all at once. Their hair was artfully straightened or curled under feathered hats. They were so pretty, like a swarm of tropical fish. "Stay close," said Sedith. "It'll be easy to lose each other here." Ferdinand almost wanted to get lost. Maybe this was a terrible idea. Maybe Hubert left because Ferdinand had been nothing but a pretty distraction while he was out of commission. The only thing that stopped him from fleeing was the drawing, with all its loving details, safe in his pocket. He caught a few scratches of conversation. Emperor and public appearance were chief among the repeated phrases. White columns lined each wall. At the front, there was a grand orchestra, wielding instruments Ferdinand had no name for. Around the edges, there was room for small gatherings of people, talking and laughing together. The only person in the room wearing red was Edelgard. Maybe there was some kind of rule. She waved at them. Ferdinand couldn't see anyone in her vicinity who might be Hubert. Maybe the plan hadn't worked.
"It's Dorothea!"
squealed Flame, tugging on his arm.
"I have to meet her. Look at her hat!"
Ferdinand blinked and realized one of the women standing with the Emperor was the opera star he'd seen so many photos of. Her hat came complete with netting and a dusky pink rose. The other woman he couldn't recall seeing in the papers. She was dressed for fighting rather than dancing. There was a sword at her belt, and she wore long combat boots. The image blurred. The whirling colors and endless noise. It was all too beautiful. Too much. Flame peered at him worriedly.
"Are you all right? You've gone white."
"I just need a moment. You go ahead while I collect myself." "No wandering off with strangers," said Sedith, but his eyes were already on Flame weaving her way through the crowd. He followed. Ferdinand leaned against a column and closed his eyes. The noise washed over him. It was different from the sound of the tide and the clicking and whirring of fish. No whale song, no splashing, no teeth biting down. Instead, he heard laughter, excited voices, the sound of cloth rustling, the patter of shoes on the shiny floor. "Ferdinand?" Everything in Ferdinand froze. There was only one person who wasn't the Emperor, Sedith or Flame, who knew his name. He opened his eyes. Hubert's face was hard and unreadable. For a long moment, they only looked at each other. He was pale, elegant, and his coat and boots were the deepest black Ferdinand had ever seen. His face was angular. He looked tired, Ferdinand decided. Maybe a little sad. "You are disappointed, perhaps?" asked Hubert. "You were imagining someone from one of your newspapers, not an illustration from a penny dreadful." Was he teasing? Ferdinand couldn't tell. He found his tongue. "Pardon? What's a penny dreadful?" "Flame fills your head with nonsense, and she did not show you? Perhaps she did not wish to frighten you." They looked at Flame. She already had a young man either side of her, and accepted a glass of bubbles from a third. Her smile was a harbinger of heartbreak. Sedith had one eye on her, and one on a woman holding a cocktail glass and making vigorous pointing gestures. Ferdinand was on his own. I have wished to see you many times," Hubert said, voice dipping so low Ferdinand had to lean closer to hear. "I must apologize for not meeting with you earlier. Perhaps you'd like a dance, while we have the opportunity." A shaky laugh. "Unfortunately, I am still getting used to the hang of legs. You will likely end up with crushed toes." "I am willing to risk my toes. I owe you that, at the very least." "In that case, we must do it. Perhaps it will jog my memory." Hubert kept him at arm's length. His touch remained polite, even as he led them through the correct movements. He stepped back. Ferdinand frowned. It was simple enough that Ferdinand couldn't stop thinking about how Hubert's shoulder was the perfect height to rest his head on. 3 minutes of perfunctory contact passed far too swiftly. Ferdinand tightened his grip as the music stopped. A sudden, furious ache seized the entirety of his lower body. It hurt, like it never had before. When he stumbled, Hubert caught him, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Ferdinand's heart made its presence known, and very much felt, so much that he felt giddy. "Let us have this dance too, and the one after that." Maybe you should sit down." "No!" Ferdinand held on for dear life. "It's like there's a song stuck in my head, but I cannot remember where I heard it, or what the words are. I want to know what it is more than anything." "Ferdinand." Something about the exasperated tone brought a handful of almost memories skidding to the surface. Ferdinand closed his eyes. A ruined ship, A ruined church. A ruined book? I am cross with you! Hubert blinked. Then his lips lifted in a slow smile. It softened the harsh lines of his face into something beautiful. In that moment, Ferdinand understood. He hadn't wanted to lose this. I was cross with you too, said Hubert. His crossness would have been more convincing if he hadn't reached for a loose strand of hair to gently curl one finger around. It felt familiar. Ferdinand tried to conjure the sights and sounds of the coast. When I remember why I'm cross, I am going to shout at you. I am fairly certain it has to do with your absence. That will be very entertaining for Her Majesty's court. Then what? Ferdinand's mind helpfully supplied a memory of warm lips on his. Oh, and now he was very obviously looking at Hubert's mouth. Scattered images washed up in the tide of his emotions. They wouldn't fit together properly, but at least he'd started gathering the pieces. In the opera, the solution is always easy. I would kiss you, and then I'd remember everything. Operas are hardly realistic. It is worth a try, is it not? As always, you are very forward. Not here. Hubert beckoned, steering him in and out of the crowd. And where do you think you're going? Oh no. Ferdinand flushed. He did not want to talk to Sedith right now. Kissing and Sedith were not thought patterns that went well together. He tried to think of the magic words to make him leave. Come back, you upright git! I'm not finished with you! An empty glass dangled dangerously from Manuela Casagranda's fingers. She looked smaller and fiercer in real life. Just as Ferdinand was praying, she had the magic words he needed. Something small and green thumped into Hubert. You never wrote me back, you charlatan, said Flame. Her lips trembled, and Hubert reeled, more than he had from the blow to his ribs. I did not wish to bore you.
That is the worst excuse I've ever heard, she declared. I expect lots of letters from now on.
About that, said Sedith. Manuela was now using him as a crutch to remain upright. He let her. Minister Casagranda has an interesting proposal.
Oh, congratulations! Mind you, it is awfully fast.
Flane, do not get the wrong idea. We have been discussing church reforms. I believe I may have some useful input on this area. So, she has asked me to stay in Enbarr for a season. Ferdinand felt giddy. We can stay? Yes. If you need time, it isn't a problem. Flame clapped her hands.
How exciting! There is much I wish to show Ferdinand.
We must be careful. Sedith's eyes bored into Ferdinand. Not going off with men likely to disappear at the drop of a hat. Hubert let out a long sigh. My actions were never intended to cause hurt. I thought leaving so Ferdinand could start a new life would be for the best. Please, at least believe I will keep him safe while he is in Enbarr. He bowed. Ferdinand felt giddy. How very unexpectedly gallant. Go, said Sedith. You do at least give an adequate apology, but I want him back before midnight. Hubert wasted no time. He took Ferdinand's arm and led him to an easily missed door. Suddenly, they were outside, in the cool evening air. When Ferdinand inhaled, he could smell the strange water from the river. Even though it wasn't the sea, it buoyed him. 1,000 lights stretched out below, glimmering like sequins. Laughter drifted up from the streets. They were very high up. He leant over the balcony for a better look, before feeling an urgent palm on his back. You will fall. Ferdinand turned into Hubert's space. His heart beat faster under his stiff shirt. He put his hand over it, startled. Not if you are here. Hubert's hair looked soft, both where it was cut short and where it hung long. His face was all angles, and each looked fascinating where it was bathed in shadows. He dropped his gaze, but let Ferdinand linger close. "This is actually a watchtower, for protecting Her Majesty. You did not tell Edelgard about me. She said she tried to get you drunk. With all respect, Her Majesty is not the brilliant schemer she thinks she is. But no, I did not tell her. Partly because the story is so absurd, I thought she might laugh. Partly because I wanted to keep you for myself. I think I wanted that too. Sedith and Flayn could not tell me much. Do you miss your home?" "I miss the Ire coast, the way it was before the war. But I do not miss living in the noisy, violent ocean. I love Enbarr, just as I knew I would. Thank you for giving me this." Hubert's shoulders sagged, like a weight had been lifted off. "About my absence earlier. It seems my agents were concerned about some visitors with unusual blood." Ferdinand remembered Sedith's protests and the odd comments the guard had made. He'd been too distracted to think much of it at the time. "You are formerly of the Ire coast, and the name Ferdinand is human. A little old-fashioned these days, but human all the same. That, coupled with a crest of keyhole, perhaps you've got some noble blood in you." Ferdinand's mouth went dry. He waited for Hubert to tell him how unnatural he was, how disturbing. Hubert only looked at him still, waiting for an answer. "Even before the spell, I did not know my father. My mother refused to speak of him. But he was human. You already had a connection to the human world. I only knew of the sailors in Ire. They sung stories and laughed when I sang back to them. Their wives sometimes fed us if there was food to spare. But when the war started, everything changed. People thought we were stealing too much fish from the bay and drove us out. My mother went to get food one day. She never came back. They killed her. Maybe. Or it could have been an orca, or a jellyfish, or a riptide. The sea is a cruel place to live. You should hate humans, like the Mers who hunt ships. Instead, you chose to save us. Why? Every human I saved had someone waiting for them to come back. I wanted to make sure they wouldn't be waiting forever." Hubert reached for him and stroked Ferdinand's cheek, like he was checking he was really there. "I'm sorry for leaving you waiting. Can I—" Ferdinand started to ask, but Hubert was already leaning in. The kiss was gentle, careful. They moved together. Ferdinand felt warm all over, every nerve and synapse sparking at once. There was magic in this. There had to be. Hubert drew Ferdinand closer still, so they were leaning into each other. His hands felt like they belonged on Ferdinand, through his hair, cupping his face, on his back. So warm, so alive. Ferdinand closed his eyes and traced a symbol into the air. Hubert curled his long fingers around Ferdinand's wrist and made a gentle correction. Together, they remembered.